Everyone doing? So, going gold. I was having some of my wife's lovely vegetarian lasagna. Going gold. I promised I'd talk about it this morning. It's a term you see game developers throw around all the time, and it's actually quite interesting. It's quite interesting about the weirdness of going gold. So, the story actually starts with music, as so many game stories do, actually. So, as you know, some of our first sound recording was sort of wax cylinders, and then we moved on to vinyl disc style recording. And so, for the longest time, you would have to record the performance live without any edit, without any alteration, because you couldn't cut up or re-edit a disc. So there was always a master recording, and you record directly to some medium, like wax, for example. And then electronic tape comes around. And when electronic tape comes around, we're still using discs as our primary distribution, vinyl discs. So what we do is we have a whole bunch of magnetic tape edited, and then there is a gold master disc produced for production. And you ask, why gold master, and why originally did you have a master disc? And it's because in analog land, every time you read a wax cylinder, or every time you read a vinyl disc, every time you play a vinyl disc, and this is true even for CDs, every time you play a CD, every time you use a CD, the medium itself degrades and wears down. And there is a chance that you'll lose the quality of the original recording. So you'd often have a master recording from which copies were made, and then copies were made from the copies to keep the master recording as pristine as possible. And you'd go to the master recording as little as possible. And one of the things they discovered as they started doing this for CDs, a lot of people don't know that different types of CD manufacturing technology, from CDRs to CD rewritables to pressed CDs, all that, they have different shelf lives. They have a different amount of time they are good for. And we tend not to think about it too much because in video game land, we're digital. So we tend not to think about analog signal degradation, and we have things like checksum bits to make sure that when we do get a little bit of wobble in the analog signal, we can usually cope. But then eventually the data degrades to the point where the disk or the sector is no longer readable on that disk. The little bit of that disk is no longer readable. So going gold for audio CDs used to actually entail writing to a high quality 24 karat gold CD. It was gold backed because gold is a very neutral metal. It's not reactive in any way, and it was a very good medium to record your master recording, which would not wear down. And so that would then be sent off to the factory, and that would get produced. So video games. Obviously, prior to us using disc medium, we used cartridges and such. And now, this is before my time, and so my knowledge of this is second and third hand. But when you were producing cartridges, you usually had 99% of the time, studios were using someone else's cartridge design or a pre-existing cartridge design. They weren't doing their own cartridge design, and they were basically loading up the game data onto an EEPROM, and they were testing it out and whatnot. And that was quite an involved process, and there was a lot of internal testing of mechanical bits in studio. Like you would have a cartridge you were programming that wasn't like your final cartridge because it had some programmable memory in it, but that was you producing your thing ready to go and ready to go off. And then what we did, people who actually tweaked their own cartridges and stuff, and were designing their own cartridges, they basically had an internal hardware manufacturing line, and they checked little things inside the studio. But then as we made the transition to discs with PlayStation, to CDs with PlayStation, PlayStation, when it got its start very much from PlayStation Music. If you look at all the people who were there at the start of PlayStation 1, they're all based, well, not all of them, but a lot of them were from the PlayStation Music division. And that means we carried a lot of the ethos of the music industry into PlayStation. And there's a lot of terms, and there's a lot of techniques and habits that were carried across. And one of those techniques or habits that was carried across was the Gold Master. And so what would happen is you would be finishing up the game, you would have what we call a gold candidate, or a release candidate, as it's sometimes called, and you'd be testing on that, and you'd be going through that, and it would be nerve-wracking, because then you would burn on this very expensive, very slow writer that would make the Gold Master. And the Gold Master was a big deal because it's a more expensive CD. It's not a consumer writer, and you would have this, and that would be given to a courier, and that courier would go off, and that would go off to the CD printing factory, and that would be the Gold Master that would be tested, finals, QA'd, and then converted to the production run. And it was still a relatively analog process. Like, there was digital bits in it, but there were little bits of checks. And I have heard a story of a disc having a corruption in it in PlayStation 1 days, and them having to redo the run because the QA passes found that they needed a new Gold Master burnt. So there was a lot of trouble around that. So what does going gold mean in modern game development? In PC land, it means a lot less, because of how digital releases work and how even your print run will work. So first of all, pressing CDs takes time, it's expensive, there's a lot of costs with packaging and stuff. So there's a big commitment for when a studio decides to go gold, because that run has to work. And prior to the internet, prior to patches, whatever was on the disc had to work, because most people wouldn't have access to patches. And it wasn't until Steam popularized automatic patching, and that took a long time. You know, even when people had easy access to the internet, most people did not download patches. And it took a while for us to transition to this land where everyone is on the latest patch, and that is 100% down to Steam. There were other people who tried it, but Steam was the team that shifted the needle on that. Another team that really did good work in that terrain is Blizzard and Battle.net. Their Battle.net launcher was very successful, and they were very good at doing patches, and especially Warcraft and Starcraft and the strategy games where balance was such a big deal and multiplayer online was such a big deal. You know, patching culture became a bigger thing. But I mean, even Counter-Strike, which is Steam and which is I think for the first, I'd say, 5 years of Counter-Strike, you had a very uneven patching technique, and some people didn't want to go on to the newest patch, and some people wanted to play on a very specific patch, and that's why you have the culture in Counter-Strike where people would speak about specific patches. But I digress. The interesting thing from going gold for game development now is mostly to do with, I'm not going to call them outdated, I'm going to call them traditional processes that console manufacturers use. First of all, no matter how modern the console, pretty much every console manufacturer agrees that someone who has not plugged their console to the internet should be able to put the disc in the console and the game should play. And so there's a couple of things that they do to enable that. The first thing is you have to realize this is a lot more common than people think. There's a lot of people, even in America, middle America, that don't connect up their console. There's a lot of parents whose kids aren't allowed to connect their console to the internet. There was a lot of work done around parental controls and sub-accounts and all that stuff to enable parents to feel more comfortable connecting their kids because the numbers were so skewed. The military deployment, that's a big one. We have a lot of people on military deployment who don't ever connect their console. There is a range of scenarios where people don't connect their console. So there's a few things that happen with a gold candidate or a master candidate to enable this. The first is, as I say, we go through the whole... so these days, even though we will often make a Blu-ray disc to test, because there's some tests that you can't do when the game's installed to drive. There's some PlayGo boot up the game, install tests while installing from the disk and all that kind of stuff. There are edge cases which we need discs to test. So studios still test discs. It's becoming less and less of a thing. Definitely becoming less of a thing. But in the mastering process, that master is uploaded through secure FTPs and proprietary file transfer techniques, because these discs are now 50 to 100 gigs typically, especially for large AAA games. And they're sent through depending on your platform provider, whether it's Nintendo, whether it's Sony, whether it's Xbox, they're sent through in a proprietary format. With a whole bunch of config information. This is things like what's the age rating of the game, what's the game's identifier, does the game use any hardware accessories, little bits of information, trophy data, things like that. There's a whole bunch of information that's part of the package. Now, again, if you're looking to an App Store or a Steam release, this is kind of outdated and it's done in a different way, but a lot of this was because these processes used to be quite offline and used to be highly optimized. Well, they still are highly optimized, but you know what I mean. So you as a studio would put together your release candidate or your gold candidate, and these days you're uploading it and you're going through a bunch of web forms and stuff, and you're pushing a button and you're sending it off, and it's not quite the intensity of, the courier standing by the door and going, okay, where's the gold master, because your CD pressing time is this specific time, and if you don't get the courier off to there, but we do still have like CD pressing slots. We do still have submission slots. We do very much have sort of time pressure still. And there is time on those manufacturing lines that is reserved. And if you miss your slot, this will often delay the game's release by anything from a week to a month to 2 months, depending on publisher, depending on agreements. You can rarely miss a date. And so now the pressure isn't so much the courier, but now the pressure is, oh shit, we have trouble with the internet and we're trying to upload a 50 gig file. And I have seen studios courier hard disks and external drives to other locations to get a build to a publisher on time, because the internet is not fast enough to upload the gold or release candidate in time, and it is faster to courier a physical hard disk to the publisher. And I have seen APs get particularly stressed about upload times and going like, well, is it going to make it in time, and because it takes hours. But yeah, so those are release candidates. They're relatively plain. They're from the studio. And then the publisher, whether it's Nintendo or Microsoft or Sony, will do their final checks on it. They will also then have signatures and keys that'll encrypt it that the studios themselves don't have. And also because we want to enable people with consoles that are never connected, they'll also put the firmware that the firmware that the disc was mastered with on the disc. So for instance, if the game was made to run on SDK6, even if SDK 6.5 or 7 is the newest, they'll put 6 on the disc. And so that means that when someone who's never connected their console to the internet puts the disc in, the disc has everything on it to update the console to the required software version. Much like how on PC you would often have discs that would have a DirectX install on, and you would have to install a specific version of DirectX because it was a supporting library or whatever. It's quite common. And yeah, in some consoles like the PlayStation 1, there would be or was it PlayStation 2? It was PlayStation 1, the black disc thing. And there would be actual physical processes as part of the manufacturing that would be done. There's actually a wonderful video by Technology Connections on YouTube where he goes into the whole black disc techniques and stuff. But basically, there was a spiral method. There was a spiral method, a wobble, to you got it, the wobble, to encrypt or certify the disk, and that was the technique, that was the various techniques used. As I say, going gold now for studios is less about submitting the release candidate. It's less about burning that 24 karat gold disc and sending it off onto a courier and getting that disc copied, a la the old audio industry. And it's more about Sony or Microsoft or Nintendo saying, yep, that's the build. You've passed all your checks. That's the thing we're building. And so typically what will happen in a studio is you'll have multiple submissions. Very, very few studios ever get through on one submission. Usually you always have a pre-sub and then you have a submission or a pre-lock and then a lock check, depending, different terminology at different consoles. And so yeah, the celebration photo that you tend to see from studios now is more about we passed all of the hurdles in the submission pipeline, and this is the version that is going to be on disk. And that is a very long and slow process. And because it's so long and slow, what typically pretty much every studio will do now is they will start work on a day one patch as they're going into pre-sub. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The main reason is that your studio is going to sit idle if you weren't doing this for anywhere between a month to 3 to 4 months. Games can be a very long time in submission, depending if there's arguments about particular issues or waivers. Studios I've seen hit really hard with this are studios who are using Unity or Unreal. Unity in particular, because Unity, most people don't have a source license. And there is some particular engine bug that holds up the submission, and there's then a back and forth not only with the developer and the console provider or multiple console providers, but also the middleware provider like Unity. And so that can be quite a long process. So day one patches are pretty typical now because of how much idle time you have. Patches tend not to go through as rigorous checks as full submissions. Different platforms have different policies, and up until about 5-10 years ago, well, I think it was early as 5 years ago, most platforms charged, they would give you like a free patch or 2 free patches or something, and then they would charge for patches past that because patching is an expensive process. There's a whole bunch of manpower on the console provider's side. As that's become more automated and as that's become patch costs have been waived or absorbed. They still cost money, but like in some cases platform holders are deciding to take on that cost themselves to encourage developers to patch their titles. Yeah, it's an interesting world we now live in with like gold masters and stuff. If you're a third-party studio, going gold is very important because most contracts will have a milestone payment structure, and hitting specific milestones is when you get money in the bank. And going gold is typically one of the biggest milestones in a contract. And so for a small studio, hitting the going gold is when a huge amount of money comes into their bank account, and it's when they can pay their employees. And studios that are tied up in going gold can have cash flow issues, have to take out bank loans. So even though we don't have the material process of going gold, it's still a very important milestone for studios. Yeah, it's still very, very critical. So reasons that submission is not accepted. So what you have to understand, because as I just said, money is involved, lots of money, large contracts, marketing deals, submission slots. There's a lot of, tying up a CD press line for ages. There's a lot of money involved with launching a title. In fact, if you're looking at a AAA game, less than 40% of the budget typically is spent on development, and more than 60% is typically spent on marketing and release and just all the guff around getting the game out. And those ratios can skew horribly. For indie titles, for any title under 5 million, that tends to be skewed differently. But most AAA titles are above 100 million, and typically more than 60 million is spent on the marketing and the deployment and the release side. Because of this, and because there's so much money involved, and because when you're dealing with companies like Ubisoft is releasing on Microsoft and on PlayStation and on PC, and there's huge amounts of money and there's lawyers involved everywhere, submission checks are not, is the game good? Nothing in a submission check is ever a qualitative measure. It's called submission check, lock check. I'm forgetting what one of them's called. I'm not saying which is which, but yeah, they're different names for different consoles. But basically, it's a series of technical requirements your game has to meet. Now, back in the day with Nintendo and stuff, and actually this was true with PlayStation as well. I don't think it's ever been true with Microsoft, but there used to be a process to even start developing the title on the console. You had to submit a green light pitch and a game pitch, but that was right at the start, and that was a qualitative assessment of, so a console could say, actually, we don't want a gory third-person shooter on our family-friendly console. So there was a rejection early on phase. That tends to have gone to the wayside. You do still need to get accredited as a developer, but that's loosening up all the time. We're letting more and more people in through the pipe. The submission part is a technical thing. So it's things like the kind of checks are, does the game run at frame rate? For VR titles, that's particularly important. Does the game call the specific function that it needs to call once every 60 milliseconds or something, and that function's like an SDK level function that does a thing, but it needs to be called every so often. Does the game do what it says on the tin? So for instance, if it says it's a multiplayer game, does it have multiplayer? Does the game correctly use branding guidelines? So for instance, if you're launching on Xbox and you call the A button the alpha button, that's a naming violation because they want naming and glyph consistency. There's often debates around approvals for specific graphics, as in like if you're drawing a controller. So like this is a trademarked symbol. The individual button designs are not trademarked, but the color and order is trademarked. And so for instance, if you have a help page that has an image of a controller that has been drawn, that has to be approved because you're using a trademark and you doing stuff with that, and they want to have consistency. So when a player picks up a new game, they're not going to see some weird wild ass control scheme that's not easy to read. There's things like, does the game not steal any data? There's things like, if Kinect is really important to the console because we're Microsoft, can you launch the title correctly with voice commands and stuff? Like, have you put in the pronunciation guide for your title into the submission package? And if you have trophies, there's a whole bunch of conditions around trophies, basically to make players' lives better, so that game developers can't say you can only get this trophy if you spend money, or you can only get this trophy. There's a bunch of different things game developers aren't allowed to do. There's an interesting conversation. Like, you can't go too much into it because all of these are NDA depending on platforms, but it's stuff that there's two buckets. I would say 30% of the bucket typically is this okay for Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo's branding guidelines, trademarks, blah blah blah. Like, you don't have a thing in your game that says like smash your controller or something stupid, right? There's a lot of legal stuff there. Then there's another bucket that is I'd say about 10-20% is this, like, does it do what it says on the tin kind of things. But I'd say 40 to 60% of these submission guidelines or these lock checks are basically, please don't fuck over our players. They've spent a lot of money on your game and our console, and we want them to have a good quality experience. And it sounds ridiculous, and for the longest time everyone thought logcheck was ridiculous, and then because everyone was like, hey, it kind of works on PCs without this check, and then the Steam wave of games happened with Greenlight and Direct $100 whatever it was thing, and with mobile games, and we're like, actually lock check and submission check and all of these things are really good, because we've seen the Wild West, and the Wild West is awful. Like, no one likes the quality problems that you have there, and especially with VR, like, not only, VR has a whole bunch of additional checks around it. Basically say, don't make the person vomit. And if you've done any amount of PC VR and PSVR and mobile VR and all that stuff, Quest, thankfully, Oculus Quest, they're starting to do like PSVR. They're doing submission checks and they're approving titles for VR. But yeah, you go into PC VR and it's a wild west of, oh god, is there going to be frame rates? Is this going to be awful? Whereas every single PSVR title you pick up, partly because the console is fixed and like everything is, so you're not going to have some random PC requirements, but a lot of it is to do with these submission checks. It's like, oh, when I put this on, I have a good experience. So yeah, they do. There's a bunch of automated checks, but a lot of it is just manual checks, which is why there's such a cost involved with that. There's such a cost involved with that. I can't speak to anything Dream specific. This is my personal channel. I'm not going to say anything there, but I will say there's a lot of checks around if your game has user generated content. And there's a whole, like, there's like a Bible, like, boom, here's a list of things your game has to do. And like, section 3, does your game have multiplayer? Okay, here's all the multiplayer checks you have to do. And like, section 6, does your game have user-generated content? Here's a whole bunch of shit your game has to do. Like, to make sure that if, give you just a common example, if your game has a specific age rating, then all your user-generated content has to be that age rating. Or if the person who owns the console has, for this account, like little Timmy, is not allowed to see user-generated content because their parents don't ever want little Timmy to see a penis. Like, you know, that. So there's crazy stuff around that, checks and stuff that have to happen. But yeah, that is the emotional and psychological thing of going gold, and why going gold is such a historical process, why it's such a emotional process for developers and a financial process, and why whenever you see a picture of a studio that's gone gold, even though we no longer are mastering a 24 karat CD, it's a big deal. Yeah, it's a big deal. It's a whole thing. So for those of you on YouTube, this is a live show. We do 8:30 every weekday in the morning. Feel free to drop by, but we are going to say bye-bye to you on YouTube for now, and we're going to do a little bit of Twitch only for now. Bye-bye.